Snowflakes the size of quarters fell not with grace, but with the heavy, blunt force of an executioner's axe. 72 miles from the nearest paved highway, Abigail Fisher stared at a woodpile that was supposed to last 3 weeks, knowing it wouldn't last 3 days. 50 below zero doesn't just make you shiver. It freezes the fluid in your eyes and turns your own breath into a weapon against you. She had no power, no radio, and a dwindling stack of damp pine, but she had a needle, some heavy thread, and a desperate grasp of thermodynamics that would become the only thing standing between her and a frozen grave. Frost crept across the windowpanes of the old Henderson cabin like jagged, skeletal fingers, slowly blotting out the fading Wyoming daylight. Abigail Fisher hugged her arms against her chest, her breath pluming in the frigid air of the living room. She had come to this remote stretch of the Wind River Range to settle the estate of her late uncle, Silas Henderson. It was supposed to be a straightforward 5-day trip in late October. Box up his books, lock the heavy shutters, and hand the keys to a realtor in town. She had not planned for a freak atmospheric anomaly, a bomb cyclone that meteorologists hadn't seen coming until the sky had already bruised purple and the barometric pressure plummeted. Within 6 hours, the snow had drifted 4 feet high against the eastern wall of the cabin. The dirt access road, a treacherous switchback path at the best of times, was completely obliterated. When the power lines snapped somewhere down the mountain, emitting a distant, hollow crack that echoed through the pines, Abigail was left in absolute, suffocating silence. She wasn't entirely helpless. Silas had lived off the grid for decades, and the cabin was equipped with a massive cast-iron Defiant wood stove that dominated the center of the main room. But as Abigail took stock of her resources, a knot of pure panic tightened in her stomach. Silas's legendary woodshed, once reputed to hold 3 cords of seasoned oak and hickory, was mostly empty. Before he passed, his failing health had clearly prevented him from chopping enough to prepare for winter. Worse, scavengers, likely local hunters or opportunistic hikers, had raided the dry stacks during the months the cabin sat empty. All that remained was a meager pile of green, unsplit pine and a few armfuls of dry birch scraps. Abigail did the math in her head, the numbers clashing with her racing heartbeat. The stove was currently consuming 3 logs every 2 hours just to keep the interior temperature hovering at a miserable 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The storm outside was howling, the wind shearing off the mountain peaks at 60 miles an hour, driving the wind chill down to a lethal -50. If she kept burning wood at this rate, she would run out in less than 48 hours. The snow was predicted to fall for 3 days, and the roads wouldn't be cleared for a week. "Okay, think," she whispered aloud, the sound of her own voice startling her in the vast, empty space. "Conserve the fuel. Shrink the footprint." She dragged the heavy oak dining table over to the kitchen archway and barricaded it with spare mattresses from the guest rooms, effectively sealing off the back half of the cabin. She closed all the doors to the bedrooms and the bathroom, confining herself to the main living area where the stove sat. It was a space measuring roughly 20 by 20 feet, 400 square feet. Even with the space reduced, the cold was relentless. The cabin was built of whole logs, but the chinking the mortar between the timbers was old, cracked, and failing. Abigail could feel actual drafts slicing through the microscopic fissures in the walls, invisible blades of ice cutting through her thermal layers. The Defiant stove radiated a fierce heat within a 3-foot radius, but beyond that, the warmth was simply devoured by the freezing air rushing in from the perimeter. By midnight of the first day, the temperature inside the living room had dropped to 35 degrees. Abigail sat huddled in a sleeping bag inches from the iron stove, watching the flames gnaw through her precious wood. She had managed to split some of the green pine, but it hissed and smoked, yielding terribly low BTUs. It took a piece of her dry birch just to keep the wet pine burning. She knew the stages of hypothermia from a wilderness first aid course she had taken years ago. First came the violent shivering, the body's desperate attempt to generate kinetic heat. Then came the apathy, the confusion, and the clumsy hands. Finally, the terminal burrowing, a physiological glitch where the dying brain suddenly feels scorching hot, prompting victims to strip off their clothes before the heart stops entirely. As the second day dawned, grey and featureless through the frosted glass, Abigail realized with chilling certainty that the math was broken. Even confined to one room, the heat loss through the poorly insulated log walls was catastrophic. The walls were acting as giant heat sinks, sucking the warmth from the stove and radiating it out into the blizzard. She had 20 logs left. It was nowhere near enough. Desperation breeds a unique kind of clarity. As her toes went numb inside her double-layered wool socks, Abigail began to tear through her uncle's belongings, looking for anything combustible. She burned old newspapers, a wooden footstool, and a stack of Silas's paperback westerns. But paper and kindling burned hot and fast, offering no lasting coals. She needed a structural solution. She needed to change the physics of the room. Searching through a heavy cedar chest at the foot of Silas's bed, her fingers stiff and clumsy from the cold, she found them. Quilts. Dozens of them. Heavy, thick, patchwork monstrosities stuffed with dense cotton batting, sewn by her late grandmother, Martha. Some were backed with flannel, others with thick denim. They were heavy, weighing 10 or 15 pounds each. Abigail dragged them into the living room, intending to just pile them over her sleeping bag. But as she sat, staring at the glowing embers of the stove, an old memory surfaced. It was a fragment of a conversation she'd had with an architectural historian in college about early pioneer survival in the Dakota Territories. "It's not the blanket that keeps you warm," the professor had said. "It's the air trapped inside the fibers. Insulation is just trapped air. The pioneers survived blizzards in uninsulated shacks by hanging tapestries or animal hides from the walls. But you have to leave a gap. If the fabric touches the freezing wall, it just conducts the cold. If you leave a gap, you create a dead air space." Dead air space. It was the principle behind double-pane windows and thermos flasks. Air that cannot circulate, cannot transfer heat via convection. Abigail scrambled to her feet, a surge of adrenaline momentarily banishing her exhaustion. She grabbed a tape measure from Silas's toolbox, along with a hammer and a box of long, framing nails. She couldn't just tack the quilts to the logs. If the heavy fabric pressed against the freezing timber, the cold would bleed straight through. She needed a consistent, unbroken buffer. Using the tape measure, she calculated exactly 2 inches. She began driving the heavy nails into the thick wooden joists of the ceiling, spacing them out along the perimeter of the living room, leaving exactly a 2-inch gap between the nail head and the log wall. It was agonizing work. Every time she lifted her arms above her head, the cold air rushed under her sweater. The iron hammer felt like a block of dry ice in her bare hands. She had to remove her gloves to tie the heavy twine required to suspend the heavy blankets. She bruised her thumb twice, the impact sending sickening waves of pain up her arm, but she couldn't stop. She took Grandmother Martha's heaviest quilts, the denim-backed ones, and drove brass grommets into the corners using a heavy punch she found in the kitchen drawers. Where she didn't have grommets, she used thick wads of duct tape to reinforce the fabric, then punched a hole for the twine. One by one, she hoisted the massive quilts, tying them to the nails in the ceiling joists. She overlapped the edges by 6 inches, pinning them together with heavy safety needles and binder clips from Silas's desk, ensuring there were no gaps to escape. The living room began to look like a padded cell, a patchwork tent erected inside the timber frame of the cabin. But the most crucial detail was the space behind the fabric. She walked the perimeter, carefully pulling the heavy quilts taut, making sure that everywhere from the ceiling to the floorboards there was exactly a 2-inch void of empty air between the quilt and the freezing logs. It took her 6 hours. By the time she tied the final knot, she was exhausted, sweating beneath her layers despite the freezing air, and her lungs burned with every breath. She collapsed onto her sleeping bag in the center of the room. Then she waited. She fed one of her precious dry birch logs into the stove and closed the damper to a slow burn. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Abigail unzipped her parka. The change was not subtle, it was miraculous. Before, the heat from the stove had felt like a localized beam of radiation that dissipated into a vacuum. Now, the heat hit the thick, insulated barrier of the quilts and bounced back. The 2-inch dead air space behind the blankets acted as an invisible, impenetrable shield. The freezing drafts that had been slicing through the chinking were stopped dead, trapped in the narrow void between the wood and the fabric. She watched the analog thermometer sitting on the coffee table. It had been stuck at 34 degrees. Slowly, the red needle ticked upward. 38, 45, 55. Within an hour, the center of the quilt-lined room was a balmy 62 degrees. Abigail let out a ragged sob of relief. She had done it. She had altered the environment. More importantly, she checked the stove. Because the room was retaining heat, she could choke the air intake valve almost completely shut. The wood smoldered, producing a slow, steady, continuous heat. Her consumption rate plummeted. The 20 logs she had left, which wouldn't have lasted a day and a half, could now easily stretch for 4, maybe 5 days. She had bought her life back. She heated a can of soup on the flat top of the Defiant stove, the smell of chicken broth filling the makeshift fabric bunker. For the first time in 48 hours, she felt safe. The wind howled furiously outside, rattling the heavy log walls, but inside her patchwork fortress, the air was still and warm. She was just drifting into a deep, exhausted sleep when the sound tore through the quiet. It wasn't the wind. It was a heavy, rhythmic thudding. It was coming from the front door, echoing dully behind the thick layer of the quilts. Thump, thump, thump. Someone was out there. Fear, cold and sharp, instantly replaced the comforting warmth of the cabin. Abigail sat up, the heavy silence of the room amplifying the pounding of her heart. The cabin was miles from the main road, accessible only by a dirt track that was currently buried under 4 feet of snow. No one should be out there. No snowplow, no ranger, no neighbor. Thump, scrape, thump. The sound was weaker now, less like a fist demanding entry, and more like a heavy object slumping against the thick oak of the door. Abigail quietly slipped out of her sleeping bag. She moved to the fireplace and picked up the heavy iron fire poker. Her hands were trembling. She approached the front entryway, having to unclip a section of the overlapping quilts she had meticulously sealed to reach the heavy wooden door. As she pulled the quilt back, a wave of freezing air assaulted her. The dead air space was hovering near 0 degrees, the logs radiating pure cold. She pressed her ear to the icy wood of the door. A ragged, wet wheeze filtered through the heavy timber. It was a human breath, rattling with fluid. "Help!" A voice croaked. So faint, the wind almost stole it completely. Abigail didn't hesitate. Survival instincts might demand self-preservation, but human conscience possessed an equally powerful gravity. She threw the heavy deadbolt and hauled the door inward. A mound of snow and ice collapsed into the entryway. It was a man. He was covered head to toe in a crust of white, his eyebrows and beard frozen solid, his lips a terrifying shade of blue. He wasn't wearing a parka or a snowmobile suit. He was wearing a heavy canvas, Carhartt jacket, denim jeans completely frozen from the knees down, and standard leather work boots. He had no hat, no gloves. He was in the final, lethal stages of hypothermia. Abigail grabbed him by the collar of his jacket and hauled him backward with all her strength. He was a dead weight, heavy and unresponsive, slipping on the frosted floorboards. She dragged him past the threshold, slammed the heavy oak door shut against the screaming blizzard, and quickly pulled the quilt back into place, sealing the freezing entryway behind the fabric. She dragged him into the center of the room, right next to the glowing stove. "Hey, can you hear me?" she shouted, tapping his cheek. His skin felt like marble. The man groaned, his eyelids fluttering. His eyes were bloodshot and unfocused. Abigail sprang into action. She knew she had to get his wet, frozen clothes off immediately, or the cold trapped in the fabric would pull whatever core heat he had left right out of his chest. She unzipped his stiff canvas jacket and pulled it off. His fingers were white and waxy, severe frostbite. She peeled off his wet flannel shirt, revealing a torso covered in dark, heavy bruising and a sprawling, intricate tattoo of a coiled serpent that stretched from his collarbone down to his ribs. She stripped him down to his thermal underwear, wrapping him in 3 of her thickest remaining blankets. She rubbed his arms and legs aggressively, not to generate heat through friction which could damage frostbitten tissue, but to stimulate circulation. She poured some of the lukewarm chicken broth into a mug and carefully tipped it past his blue lips. He coughed, sputtering, and his eyes suddenly snapped into focus. He looked wildly around the room, taking in the bizarre, quilt-lined walls, the roaring stove, and finally, Abigail, holding the fire poker casually but firmly in her left hand. Where am I?" he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves crushed underfoot. "You're about 70 miles from anywhere," Abigail said, keeping her voice steady. "Henderson cabin. You were freezing to death on my porch." The man swallowed hard, shivering violently as his body finally registered the warmth of the room and began the agonizing process of thawing. "Truck," he stammered. "My truck slid off the ridge road, rolled twice. I walked. I don't know how long. Saw the smoke from your chimney." "What's your name?" Abigail asked. "Caldwell," he said, rubbing his eyes with his waxy, stiff fingers. "Well, Thomas, you're lucky to be alive. Drink the broth." As Thomas weakly sipped the warm liquid, Abigail assessed him. The relief of saving a life was rapidly fading, replaced by a cold, crawling paranoia. Things didn't add up. First, the ridge road he mentioned was an old logging track on the west side of the mountain. If his truck had rolled there, he would have had to hike 4 miles uphill, through 4 feet of unbroken snow, in a blizzard, wearing work boots and no gloves. It was physically impossible. Second, the bruises on his torso. They were dark, purple and yellow, clearly several days old. They hadn't come from a recent truck crash. They looked like the aftermath of a violent, sustained beating. And third, the snake tattoo. Abigail had worked as a social worker in Denver for 5 years before transitioning to accounting. She recognized prison ink when she saw it. The coiled serpent with a crown was a known affiliation mark for a regional syndicate involved in meth distribution. Thomas Caldwell wasn't a lost traveler who took a wrong turn. "This setup," Thomas said, his voice gaining a fraction of strength as he looked around the fabric walls. "The blankets. Smart. Real smart. It's warm in here." "Thermodynamics," Abigail said tightly. "Dead airspace." He looked at the small, neat stack of firewood she had left. "Ain't got much wood, though." "Do you?" Abigail felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The space suddenly felt incredibly small. A 400-square-foot room. Before, the Quilts had felt like a fortress keeping the deadly cold out. Now, looking at the man shivering on the floor, his dark eyes calculating the volume of her woodpile, the Quilts felt like the walls of a cage. She had cut her firewood consumption in half to save her own life. But now, she was trapped in a sealed box with a stranger who was lying about who he was and where he came from. And as Thomas Caldwell's eyes locked onto hers, a chilling realization settled over Abigail. The cold outside was no longer the most dangerous thing in the cabin. "I have enough wood," Abigail lied smoothly, adjusting her grip on the heavy iron poker. "More than enough." Thomas offered a thin, trembling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's good, Abigail, because we're going to be stuck in here for a while." The wind outside the Henderson cabin did not howl. It shrieked like metal, tearing in a junkyard. Inside the 400-square quilt-lined sanctuary, the air was thick, smelling of wood smoke, sweat, and wet canvas. Abigail sat cross-legged on her sleeping bag, the heavy iron fire poker resting across her knees. Across the stove, Thomas Caldwell was huddled under Grandmother Martha's thickest floral blanket. The waxy pallor of frostbite had left his face, replaced by a raw, angry red, as his capillaries violently dilated. He was recovering faster than a man in his condition should. "Stop staring at me," Thomas rasped, his eyes fixed on the cast-iron stove. "I ain't gonna bite. You have a crown and serpent tattooed on your chest, Thomas," Abigail said, her voice a flat, emotionless line. "I worked out of the Denver Social Services office for 5 years before I moved to accounting. I know exactly what that ink means. You did time at the Wyoming State Penitentiary in Rawlins. Or you run with the boys who did." Thomas shifted, his jaw tightening. The facade of the helpless, freezing traveler instantly evaporated, replaced by the hard, calculating gaze of a predator who had just been cornered. He let out a low, raspy chuckle that turned into a wet cough. "You're a smart girl, Abigail," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of a bruised hand. "Too smart to be stuck up here playing pioneer. So, let's skip the pleasantries. Yeah, I did a nickel in Rawlins, aggravated assault, but I paid my debt to society. And the bruises?" she asked, gesturing with her chin toward his ribs. "Did society give you those this morning?" Thomas's eyes darkened. "Minor disagreement over logistics with some former business associates in Casper. They thought they owned my truck. I disagreed. They had crowbars. I had a tire iron. I drove off, hit black ice on the Ridge Road." He was lying. Or at least, heavily omitting the truth. Abigail could see it in the way his eyes flicked constantly toward the pile of his wet clothes near the entryway. "You're dehydrated," Abigail said, deciding to shift the dynamic. She needed to maintain control of the resources. "I have 1/2 gallon of melted snow water left before I have to go out to the porch for more. You can have 1 cup." As she stood to pour the water from a tin kettle resting on the edge of the stove, Thomas abruptly reached out, grabbing her wrist. His grip was weak, his fingers still stiff from the cold, but the intent was violent. "Don't ration me," he growled. Abigail didn't flinch. She simply brought the heavy iron poker down, bringing the blunt hook to rest directly against his collarbone, right over a dark purple bruise. She applied just an ounce of pressure. Thomas hissed in pain and let go. "This is my cabin," Abigail said, her voice dropping an octave. "This is my wood. And this dead airspace keeping your blood from turning to slush was my design. You touch me again, and I will drag you back out that front door and lock it." Thomas rubbed his collarbone, a sneer curling his lips. But he nodded slowly. "Understood. Boss, drink the water. Then sleep." For the next 4 hours, Abigail forced herself to stay awake. She watched Thomas's chest rise and fall in the dim orange glow of the stove. When she was absolutely certain he was in a deep REM sleep, evidenced by the rapid twitching of his eyes beneath his lids, she quietly stood up. She stepped subtly over the floorboards, knowing exactly which ones creaked, and approached his discarded, thawing clothes. She picked up his heavy canvas Carhartt jacket. It was still damp, but as she lifted it, she noticed it was unnaturally heavy on the left side. She slipped her hand into the deep interior pocket. Her fingers brushed against cold, hard canvas. She pulled it out. It was a tightly bound, heavy canvas bag, about the size of a brick, wrapped in layers of duct tape. Using a pocket knife from Silas's toolbox, she carefully sliced a small slit in the tape and the canvas beneath it. Dull, yellow stones spilled into her palm. Placer gold. Raw, unrefined nuggets, likely dredged from a river claim. It was easily 5 pounds of it. At current market prices, she was holding over $150,000 in raw, untraceable gold. Her breath hitched. This wasn't a minor disagreement. Thomas hadn't just fought with his associates. He had robbed them. And the men he robbed were the kind who used crowbars and broke ribs. If they were tracking him, If they knew he had headed up the mountain, Abigail hastily shoved the gold back into the jacket pocket. She looked at the quilt-lined walls. The dead airspace was keeping the freezing death of the blizzard at bay, but it had also trapped her in a tiny, inescapable room with a desperate, violent man guarding a fortune in stolen gold. She backed away, returning to her sleeping bag, her mind racing. She had to survive the cold, but now she also had to survive Thomas Caldwell. By 3 a.m. on the third night, the dynamics of the room had fundamentally shifted, though not in the way Abigail had feared. The danger did not come from a physical attack, but from a fatal miscalculation of her own genius design. Abigail woke to a throbbing, sickening ache behind her eyes. It felt as though an ice pick was being driven into the base of her skull. Her stomach churned violently, and when she tried to sit up, the room spun in a dizzying, nauseating circle. She gasped, her lungs feeling heavy and useless. She looked toward the center of the room. The cast-iron Defiant stove, which she had carefully throttled down to a slow, efficient smolder before sleeping, was now roaring. The iron flanks of the stove were glowing a dull, angry cherry red. Thomas. He had woken up shivering, his compromised circulatory system unable to handle the ambient 60 degrees of the room. Ignoring her strict rationing, he had opened the air intake damper entirely and stuffed the firebox full of the green, unseasoned pine. The wet wood wasn't just burning. It was smoking heavily, struggling to combust fully in the intense heat. And because the damper was wide open, the draft was pulling aggressively. But there was a critical problem: the dead air space. Abigail's meticulous quilting job had sealed the room perfectly. It had stopped the cold air from coming in, but it had also completely sealed off any fresh oxygen from replacing what the stove was consuming. In a normal log cabin, the drafty chinking would allow the room to breathe. Here, the heavy quilts and the 2-inch void behind them acted like a plastic bag pulled tightly over their heads. The roaring stove was rapidly consuming all the oxygen in the 400-square-foot space, replacing it with carbon monoxide, the silent, odorless killer. "Thomas," Abigail choked out, her voice a weak, pathetic wheeze. Thomas was slumped against the wall, his head lolling to the side, his eyes half open but completely unseeing. A thick string of saliva hung from his lip. He was already slipping into a severe hypoxic coma. Panic, primal and terrifying, cut through the fog in Abigail's brain. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled instantly. The lack of oxygen was starving her muscles. She collapsed onto the floorboards, her vision narrowing to a dark tunnel. "Crawl!" her brain screamed. She dragged herself across the floor, every inch a monumental effort. Her head pounded with a ferocity that made her want to vomit. She reached the stove. The heat radiating from it was blistering, searing her face. But she forced herself to reach up and slam the iron damper shut, cutting off the aggressive air intake. But it wasn't enough. The room was already filled with toxic gas. She needed to vent the space, and she needed to do it immediately. She turned toward the front door, hidden behind the overlapping layers of heavy denim quilts. It looked a mile away. Breathe. Just breathe. But breathing only brought more poison into her lungs. She dragged herself toward the entryway, her fingernails scrabbling against the rough wood of the floor. When she finally reached the quilt barrier, her arms felt like lead. She reached up, her fingers fumbling blindly for the heavy binder clips and safety needles holding the fabric together. She couldn't grip them. Her motor skills were completely degrading. Desperate, Abigail grabbed the fabric of the quilt with both hands and threw her entire body weight backward. With a loud, sharp re-ppp, the brass grommets tore free from the twine. The nails in the ceiling groaned and pulled loose from the joists. A massive 8-foot section of the heavy quilt collapsed onto the floor. Instantly, the dead airspace was breached. The barrier was broken. The heavy, suffocating warmth of the room slammed into the sheer, brutal -40-degree cold radiating from the log walls. A shockwave of freezing air rushed into the room, sweeping over Abigail like a bucket of ice water. It was agonizing. It was freezing. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever felt. Oxygen. She lay on the floor, gasping hungrily, sucking the freezing pure air into her burning lungs. The cold immediately began to bite at her skin, numbing her fingers and toes within seconds, but the crushing headache began to slowly recede. The dark tunnel in her vision widened. She lay there for 10 minutes, letting the freezing draft purge the carbon monoxide from the room. The temperature plummeted from a sweltering 80 degrees down to 30 in a matter of minutes. Shivering violently, Abigail forced herself up. She stumbled over to Thomas. He was pale, his breathing dangerously shallow, but as the fresh, freezing air hit him, he let out a loud snort and shifted. He wasn't dead. Not yet. Abigail looked at the collapsed section of the quilt. The perfectly engineered survival cell was compromised. She had saved them from suffocating, but now the cold was rushing back in, hungry and relentless. She had to rebuild the wall, but she had to leave a vent, a controlled breach. She dragged herself up, grabbed her hammer, and prepared to fight the ice once again, knowing that the man waking up behind her was just as dangerous as the storm outside. The repair was brutal. With her muscles still trembling from oxygen deprivation and the ambient temperature inside the living room plummeting past freezing, Abigail forced her stiff fingers to retie the heavy twine. She hoisted the 8-foot section of Grandmother Martha's denim quilt back toward the ceiling joists, but this time she altered the design. She left a calculated 4-inch gap near the top corner, closest to the chimney flue, and propped it open with a wooden coat rack. It compromised the absolute efficiency of the dead airspace, bleeding about 15% of their heat into the freezing chinking of the log walls, but it created a necessary convection draft. The heavy carbon monoxide would now have an escape route, pulled up and out by the drawer of the chimney, while fresh oxygen seeped in through the microscopic cracks in the floorboards. She collapsed back onto her sleeping bag just as the analog thermometer stabilized at 48 degrees. It wasn't the balmy 60 she had achieved earlier, but it was survivable. A heavy groan brought her head snapping up. Thomas Caldwell was shifting beneath his pile of blankets. The influx of freezing air had shocked his system back to consciousness. He rolled onto his side, violently dry heaving onto the floorboards, his body expelling the physiological stress of the near-fatal poisoning. "What?" he gasped, clutching his chest. "What happened?" "You almost killed us," Abigail said, her voice hoarse, devoid of any bedside sympathy. She didn't move from her spot, keeping the iron fire poker resting easily across her knees. "You opened the damper and burned wet pine in a sealed room. The fire consumed the oxygen and pumped the space full of carbon monoxide. I had to tear the wall down to vent the room." Thomas blinked heavily, his bloodshot eyes darting around the makeshift fabric bunker, lingering on the newly created gap near the ceiling. He looked at the cast iron stove, which Abigail had wrestled back down to a controlled, smouldering burn. "My head feels like it's been split with an axe," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "That's the hypoxia. Drink some water, and do not touch the stove again." Thomas slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position. The waxy, frost-bitten pallor was completely gone from his fingers, replaced by a deep, painful-looking purple. He was recovering, and with that recovery came the return of his sharp, predatory edge. He scanned the room, his gaze finally falling on the pile of his wet clothes. Abigail felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit her stomach. She had pushed the gold back into the deep canvas pocket, but she hadn't had time to reseal the duct tape. Thomas reached out and pulled the heavy Carhartt jacket toward him. He didn't put it on. Instead, with a casualness that was entirely feigned, he slipped his hand into the interior pocket. Abigail watched his shoulder tense. The subtle shift in his posture was louder than a gunshot. He felt the slit in the tape. He slowly withdrew his hand, leaving the heavy canvas bag inside. He didn't yell. He didn't lunge at her. Instead, he looked at Abigail, his dark eyes devoid of any warmth. "You went through my pockets," he said softly. "It wasn't a question." "I was looking for ID," Abigail lied, maintaining eye contact. "In case you died. The authorities usually like to know who to put on the toe tag." A dry, rattling laugh escaped Thomas's throat. "Right. The authorities. You know, Abigail, I had a partner once. Name was Arthur Pendleton. We were dredging a claim up near South Pass City. Arthur got greedy. He started holding back a few ounces every week. Thought I wouldn't notice the weight difference in the sluice box." He leaned forward, the floral quilt slipping off his broad, bruised shoulders. "You know what happened to Arthur? I imagine you handled it with the same diplomacy you used on the men in Casper," Abigail said coldly. "I didn't have to touch him." Thomas smiled, a grim, terrifying expression. "Arthur went out to check the generator during a squall. I just locked the cabin door, sat by the fire, and listened to him beat on the wood for about 3 hours. The cold does the dirty work for you. It's clean. Leaves. No marks." He let the threat hang in the heavy 48-degree air. The implication was crystal clear. He knew she had seen the gold. He knew she knew what he was. And he was letting her know exactly how disposable she was. "The barometer is rising," Abigail said, abruptly changing the subject. She tapped the glass of Silas's antique weather station sitting on the mantel. "The pressure is shifting. The snow will stop falling by tomorrow morning. The county plows won't make it up the access road for at least 3 days, but the sky will be clear." Thomas looked at the frosted window pane, barely visible behind the edge of the quilt wall. "Clear skies mean helicopters, game wardens, search and rescue." "Exactly," Abigail said. "If your former associates reported their truck stolen, or if the police are looking for you, a plume of smoke coming from an isolated cabin is going to draw a lot of attention. Then we won't have a fire," Thomas stated flatly. "If we extinguish the stove, the dead air space will only retain body heat for about 6 hours. After that, this room will drop below freezing. With your compromised circulation, your core temperature will plummet. You'll be in a hypothermic coma before noon." Thomas stared at the glowing iron of the stove, his mind calculating the brutal mathematics of their survival. He needed the fire to live, but the fire was a beacon to the men he had robbed. He needed Abigail's knowledge of the cabin to survive the night, but once the sun came up, she became the only witness to his location and his stolen fortune. "We keep the fire low," Thomas finally decided, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. "Tomorrow, when the storm breaks, you're going to pack me whatever supplies you have left. Snowshoes, rations. I'm hiking out down the eastern slope toward the rail line." "You'll never make it," Abigail said. "The snowdrifts are 8 feet deep on the eastern ridge." "I'll make it," Thomas said, his eyes locking onto hers with lethal intent. "And you're going to stay right here, Abigail. You're going to wait 3 days. You aren't going to light a fire. You aren't going to signal anyone. Because if I see a chopper flying over that ridge before I reach the tracks, I swear to God I will turn around, hike back up here, and I will do to you exactly what I did to Arthur Pendleton." Abigail didn't blink. Understood. But as she watched Thomas settle back under the blankets, his hand now firmly resting over the pocket of his jacket, Abigail's mind was racing faster than the dying winds outside. She wasn't a pioneer, and she wasn't a killer. But she understood systems. She understood insulation, convection, and physics. Thomas thought he held all the power because he had a willingness to commit violence. But Abigail controlled the environment, and she had exactly 12 hours to turn the dead air space from a sanctuary into a trap. The morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a brittle, blinding grey glare that pierced through the frosted window panes. The shrieking wind had died, replaced by an eerie, deafening silence. The bomb cyclone had finally exhausted itself, leaving the Wind River Range buried under a monolithic ocean of white. Inside the quilt-lined bunker, the tension was as thick and suffocating as the carbon monoxide had been the night before. Thomas was up, pacing the small perimeter of the room. His boots clomped heavily against the floorboards. He was moving with a frantic, nervous energy, his eyes constantly scanning the ceiling as if waiting for the sound of a rotor blade. He had forced Abigail to gather the last of Silas's dry goods, 3 cans of baked beans, a box of stale granola bars, and a half-empty jar of peanut butter, and stuff them into a canvas rucksack. "Snowshoes," Thomas demanded, zipping his heavy Carhartt jacket. The rectangular bulge of the gold was clearly visible against his ribs. "Where are they?" "In the mudroom," Abigail said, remaining seated by the stove. Through the front entryway. Thomas stopped pacing. He looked at the heavy, overlapping layers of the denim quilts that sealed off the front door. Behind that fabric was the vestibule, a 5 by 5 foot uninsulated entryway that led to the heavy oak front door. Because it was outside the dead air space, the vestibule was currently sitting at the ambient outdoor temperature, -25 degrees. "Get them," he ordered. "I can't," Abigail said calmly, stirring the last cup of lukewarm water in a tin cup. "I used the last of the safety needles to pin that section closed. If I open it, we lose the heat." "We're losing the heat anyway," Thomas snapped, pulling a heavy iron wrench from the pocket of his jeans. He had raided Silas's toolbox while she slept. "I'm leaving. Open the damn wall." Abigail stood up slowly. She walked over to the thickest section of the quilt wall, the part that covered the archway to the mudroom. She reached up and unclipped 2 of the heavy binder clips. A wave of bitter, stinging cold immediately spilled into the room, rolling across the floorboards like a physical fog. Thomas flinched, pulling his collar up. "The snowshoes are on the wall to the left," Abigail said, pulling the heavy fabric back just enough for a man to squeeze through. "The bindings are old leather. You'll need to check them before you step out into the drifts." Thomas sneered, hefting the iron wrench. "You think I'm stupid? You think I'm going to turn my back on you in a dark room? You go first." This was the moment. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had anticipated this. She had built the trap around his paranoia. "Fine," she said smoothly. She stepped through the gap in the quilts, plunging into the brutal, lung-searing cold of the mudroom. The temperature drop was so violent it felt like walking into a wall of knives. The air in the tiny space was completely stagnant, a frozen tomb locked between the heavy oak front door and the insulated quilt barrier. She walked to the far wall, her breath pluming in thick white clouds. She grabbed the antique wooden snowshoes hanging from a peg. Thomas stepped through the quilt barrier behind her. He shivered violently as the -25-degree air hit him. "Hurry up," he hissed, his eyes darting to the small, frosted window on the oak door. "The leather is stiff," Abigail said, turning her back to him, fumbling with the bindings. "It's frozen solid. Give them to me," Thomas barked, taking 2 steps toward her, his heavy boots echoing in the tiny space. He reached out with his left hand to grab the wooden frames. Abigail didn't hand them over. Instead, she dropped them directly onto his steel-toed boots. As Thomas instinctively looked down, dropping his guard for a fraction of a second, Abigail moved with a speed born of pure, unadulterated terror. She didn't attack him. She didn't swing the fire poker she had left by the stove. She lunged sideways, diving past him with a desperate burst of agility. "Hey!" Thomas yelled, swinging the heavy iron wrench blindly in the dim light. It missed her shoulder by an inch, smashing violently into the log wall. Abigail threw her weight against the heavy denim quilt. She tumbled back into the warm, 60-degree sanctuary of the living room, rolling hard onto the floorboards. Before Thomas could recover his balance and turn around, Abigail scrambled to her knees. She grabbed the 2 heavy edges of the denim quilt and slammed them together. Clack, clack, clack. Her hands moved with frantic precision, snapping the heavy black binder clips over the folded fabric, sealing the seam perfectly. She drove a spare framing nail through the top grommet, anchoring it to the doorframe. "Abigail!" Thomas roared from the other side. A heavy thud shook the fabric as he threw his shoulder against the quilt. But Abigail hadn't just used the fabric to separate the rooms. She had built this specific section over the narrow, heavy wooden archway of the mudroom doorframe. She grabbed the heavy oak dining chair she had positioned nearby and jammed it under the doorknob of the actual interior door, pinning it shut against the frame behind the quilt. "Open the door!" Thomas screamed, his voice muffled by the thick denim and the solid wood. The iron wrench smashed against the interior door, the sound dull and distant. "Thwack! Thwack! You're in the dead air space, Thomas!" Abigail shouted back, her voice shaking but her resolve absolute. "But it's not retaining heat. It's retaining the cold. Thwack! Thwack!" The wrench hit the wood again, but the heavy oak, reinforced by the chair, barely groaned. "I'll kill you. I'll break this door down and I'll kill you. You'll freeze before you break through oak," Abigail called out, stepping back toward the warmth of the stove. "The temperature in that mudroom is 20 below. With your compromised circulation, you have about 10 minutes before your hands freeze to the point where you can't hold that wrench. 20 minutes until hypothermia shuts down your nervous system." The hammering stopped. A terrifying silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the wood in the defiant stove. "Abigail." Thomas's voice came through the wood, no longer a roar, but a desperate, rattling wheeze. The bravado was gone. The cold was already stripping it away. "Please. It's freezing out here. The front door is frozen shut. I can't get out." "I know," Abigail said softly, staring at the perfectly sealed seam of the quilt. "I'll leave the gold. I'll leave everything. Just let me back in. Please. I don't want to die like Arthur." Abigail closed her eyes. The empathetic, social worker part of her brain screamed to pull the chair away, to open the quilt and save a human life. But the survivor in her, the woman who had spent 3 days fighting the ice and a murderer in a 400-square-foot box, knew the truth. If she opened that door, he would kill her for the gold and the silence. She didn't answer. She walked over to the stove, picked up a single, dry birch log, and carefully placed it onto the glowing embers. Behind the heavy layer of Grandmother Martha's quilt, the desperate thudding grew weaker and weaker, until finally there was nothing but the profound, overwhelming silence of the winter mountain. Abigail Fisher sat absolutely motionless on her sleeping bag, her eyes locked on the heavy black binder clips that held the denim quilt together. For the first hour, the silence from the mudroom was more terrifying than the shouting had been. She waited for the sound of shattering wood, for the heavy iron wrench to finally splinter the oak door. But nothing came. Physics is an unforgiving master. And in a 20 below zero uninsulated vestibule, the human body fails with frightening speed. Abigail knew the physiological timeline by heart. First, Thomas's peripheral blood vessels would have constricted, sacrificing his frostbitten fingers and toes to keep his vital organs warm. Then, the violent shivering would have started, burning through whatever meager calories he had left. Finally, as his core temperature dropped below 90 degrees, severe apathy and confusion would have set in, dropping him to the freezing floorboards. By the time the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the living room chimed noon, Abigail knew Thomas Caldwell was dead. She did not cry. The sheer weight of the adrenaline pumping through her system left no room for grief or guilt. She had simply engaged in a brutal equation of survival, and her variable, the dead airspace, had proven superior to his variable of brute force. Over the next 48 hours, Abigail lived a ghostly existence inside her 400-square-foot fabric bunker. She fell into a rigid, mechanical routine. Every 4 hours, she fed exactly 1/2 split log of green pine and a handful of dry birch into the defiant stove, keeping the ambient temperature at a precarious 45 degrees. She melted snow in her tin kettle, drank the lukewarm water, and ate half a stale granola bar. The walls of her sanctuary, the heavy patchwork quilts sewn by Grandmother Martha, felt different now. They were no longer just an ingenious barrier against the bomb cyclone. They were the walls of a crypt. The dead airspace behind the fabric was still trapping the freezing drafts, but it was also holding back the gruesome reality of what lay just on the other side of the mudroom archway. Paranoia began to fray the edges of her sanity. Even though she knew Thomas was gone, every pop of the cooling iron stove, every settling creak of the cabin's timber frame, made her snatch up the heavy fire poker. She slept in 10-minute increments, her dreams plagued by visions of a frozen man with a coiled serpent tattoo, slowly prying the binder clips apart with blue, stiff fingers. On the morning of the 5th day, the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted. The oppressive, heavy feeling in her ears, the hallmark of extreme low barometric pressure, vanished. Abigail slowly stood up, her joints popping in the cold room. She walked to the small 4-inch ventilation gap she had created near the ceiling joists. Standing on her toes, she peered through the frosted glass of the upper window pane. Brilliant, blinding sunlight fractured the grey gloom of the living room. The sky over the Wind River Range was a piercing, cloudless azure. The snow had stopped. The storm was over, but her ordeal was about to enter its most dangerous phase. She had to signal for help. But to do that, she had to break the seal. She had to open the mudroom door, confront the frozen corpse of a cartel runner, and somehow explain to the authorities why she was alive and he was dead. She spent an hour mentally rehearsing her story. It had to be airtight. It had to align perfectly with the forensic evidence the police would find. She would tell them the truth, mostly. She would tell them a desperate man crashed his truck and sought shelter. She would tell them he became violent, demanded her supplies, and tried to force her out into the blizzard. She would tell them she managed to barricade the interior door, leaving him trapped in the unheated entryway. It was self-defense in its purest, most primal form, but there was one massive, heavy detail she could not share. Abigail pulled a flathead screwdriver from Silas's toolbox. She walked to the far corner of the living room, furthest from the stove, and knelt beside the heavy oak floorboards. Finding a loose plank her uncle used to hide his spare house keys, she pried it up, exposing the dark, dry earth beneath the cabin's foundation. She had a decision to make. If the police found 5 pounds of raw, unrefined placer gold on Thomas's body, they would immediately connect it to the regional syndicate in Casper. The cartel would learn exactly where Thomas died, and more importantly, they would learn who was with him. Men who beat their partners with crowbars and left them to freeze to death would not hesitate to track down an accountant in Denver to silence a witness or search for missing product. For her own safety, Thomas Caldwell had to be nothing more than a random, unfortunate drifter who succumbed to the elements. Taking a deep breath, Abigail approached the heavy denim quilt covering the mudroom archway. Her hands trembled as she popped the first black binder clip. The sharp snap echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. She removed the clips one by one, pulling the heavy fabric back. The blast of sub-zero air that hit her face was a physical blow, instantly freezing the moisture in her nostrils. She pulled the heavy oak dining chair away from the doorknob. Her hand hovered over the brass latch. She gripped it, turned it, and pushed the door open. Thomas Caldwell lay curled in a tight fetal position against the heavy oak of the exterior front door. His skin was a horrifying, waxy shade of pale blue, his lips drawn back over his teeth in a frozen grimace. His eyes were open, crystallized and unseeing, staring blankly at the frost-covered window pane. In his right hand, locked in a state of extreme rigor mortis, he still gripped the heavy iron wrench. Abigail forced herself to step into the freezing vestibule. Her breath hitched in her throat as she knelt beside the dead man. The smell of the cold was sterile, masking any scent of death. She reached for the heavy Carhartt jacket. It was stiff as a board, the fabric completely frozen solid. She had to use the flathead screwdriver to pry the thick canvas lapel open. She slipped her hand into the deep interior pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold, duct-taped canvas bag. She pulled the gold free. It felt heavier now, weighted with the lives it had already cost. Without looking back at Thomas's frozen face, Abigail retreated into the living room. She walked to the pried-up floorboard, dropped the heavy canvas bag into the dark dirt, and nailed the oak plank back into place, securing it with 3 heavy framing nails. She kicked a layer of dust and wood chips over the seam. The gold was gone. The motive was buried. Now, she just had to survive. The rescue. Black soot plumed against the brilliant blue sky. A stark, ugly beacon rising from the stone chimney of the Henderson cabin. Abigail had thrown the last of her green pine and 2 pairs of rubber rain boots into the defiant stove, creating a thick, acrid smoke signal that could be seen for 20 miles across the pristine, snow-drowned peaks. She sat on the front porch, wrapped in 3 of Grandmother Martha's quilts, the heavy oak door propped open behind her. Thomas's body remained untouched in the vestibule. She let the freezing mountain air flood into the cabin, officially breaking the dead airspace. The fortress had served its purpose. She no longer needed it to hide her. It took 3 hours for the rhythmic, heavy thwack-thwack-thwack of a rotor blade to echo off the canyon walls. A yellow and black search and rescue helicopter crested the eastern ridge, hovering like a giant, noisy dragonfly over the clearing. The downdraft kicked up a localized blizzard, forcing Abigail to shield her face as the skids touched down on the 4-foot crust of the snowpack. 2 men piled out, dressed in heavy neon orange parkas. They trudged through the deep drifts, their faces a mix of professional urgency and sheer disbelief. "Ma'am, are you injured?" shouted the first man, a tall, broad-shouldered officer with a badge pinned to his chest. "I'm Sheriff Boyd, Sublette County. This is Deputy Miller. We saw the black smoke." "I'm okay," Abigail rasped, her voice cracking. The sheer relief of hearing another human voice nearly broke her. "I'm Abigail Fisher. This is my uncle's cabin." Deputy Miller, a younger man with a thick beard, pushed past them, stepping onto the porch to check the interior of the cabin. A second later, he stumbled backward, his hand instinctively dropping to the radio on his shoulder. "Sheriff, we got a body in the entryway. Frozen, solid. Male. Looks like he's been dead a few days. He's got a weapon in his hand." Sheriff Boyd's demeanor instantly shifted from rescue worker to law enforcement. He looked at Abigail, his eyes narrowing against the glare of the snow. "Miss Fisher, what happened here?" Abigail pulled the heavy quilts tighter around her shoulders. She looked the sheriff dead in the eye, channeling every ounce of her remaining strength. "He showed up on the second night of the storm," she said, her voice a steady, rehearsed monotone. "He said he crashed his truck. I let him in to warm up, but he got violent. He wanted my food, my wood. He tried to force me out into the snow. I managed to slip past him, barricade the inner door, and lock him in the mudroom. I didn't have a choice." Boyd stared at her for a long, silent moment. He looked past her, into the cabin, noting the bizarre, quilt-lined walls, the heavy oak dining chair lying near the doorframe, and the deep gouges in the wood where the iron wrench had struck. The physical evidence was an exact, perfect map of her story. "You built a thermal envelope," Boyd said, recognizing the survival tactic. "My granddad used to do that up in the Yukon. Hung moving blankets from the ceiling to trap the heat around the stove. Dead airspace," Abigail confirmed softly. "It cut my firewood consumption in half. It's the only reason I didn't freeze to death in there." Deputy Miller emerged from the mudroom, his face pale. "No ID on the deceased, Sheriff. But he's got prison ink on his chest. Looks like he beat on that door until his hands stopped working. It's a clean self-defense scene." Boyd nodded slowly, letting out a heavy breath that plumed in the cold air. The tension bled out of his posture. He wasn't looking at a murderer. He was looking at a miracle. "You're a brave woman, Miss Fisher. Let's get you on the bird. We'll send a forensic recovery team up here tomorrow when the plows clear the lower access road to deal with our guest." As Deputy Miller guided her through the deep snow toward the waiting helicopter, Abigail stopped and looked back at the cabin one last time. The heavy log structure looked small and insignificant against the towering, snow-capped peaks of the Wind River Range. Inside, the fire was dying out, the ambient temperature rapidly dropping to match the brutal cold outside. Underneath the floorboards, buried in the dark earth, lay $150,000 in stolen gold, a silent, heavy anchor tying her forever to the nightmare of the bomb cyclone. She had survived the ice. She had survived Thomas Caldwell, and she had ensured the cartel would never know her name. "Come on, Miss Fisher," Deputy Miller said gently, helping her up into the warm cabin of the helicopter. "You're safe now. You're going home." Abigail sank into the canvas seat, pulling the headset over her ears as the engines whined to a deafening roar. As the helicopter lifted off, banking sharply over the endless sea of white pine, she looked down at her hands. They were bruised, battered, and permanently scarred by the freezing cold, but they were alive. She closed her eyes, finally letting the exhaustion claim her, knowing that the dead airspace had taken a life, but it had ultimately saved her own. Abigail Fisher's survival in the Wind River Range remains a chilling testament to the brutal, unforgiving intersection of human desperation and the laws of thermodynamics. Confronted with a lethal bomb cyclone and a rapidly dwindling fuel supply, she weaponized the very physics of her environment, utilizing the dead airspace behind her grandmother's quilts to forge an impenetrable shield against -50-degree cold. Yet, the true horror of her ordeal was not the blizzard, but the deadly predator it forced her to shelter. When forced to choose between her life and his, Abigail proved that the intellect required to engineer a thermal sanctuary is the exact same intellect required to engineer a flawless, freezing trap. She walked away from the mountain with her life, a dark secret buried beneath the floorboards, and the profound, haunting knowledge that sometimes survival demands letting the cold do the dirty work.